The night sky above the battlefield was filled with smoke and silent sparks of machines left broken after the fight had ended, and in the middle of that ruined land a young alien woman named Lyra sat with her hands bound behind her back, her breathing uneven and her thoughts racing like waves in a storm. She had been taught since childhood that humans were merciless creatures who lived only for conquest and destruction. And now as she sat among the wreckage with a human soldier standing guard over her, she believed every story she had ever heard was about to come true. The soldier's name was Daniel, and though Lyra did not know it yet, he had not taken part in the slaughter that her people had suffered, but had instead been ordered to watch over her until the higher commanders decided her fate. To her, it made little difference, for she expected that fate to be death. She looked at him from the corner of her eyes, taking in the shape of his figure, tall, strong shoulders covered in dust, his weapon slung across his back, his face unreadable, and his eyes seeming as cold as the stars above. She lowered her head, unable to stop the trembling in her arms. Her kind had fought bravely, but they had never truly understood the humans. They had believed humans weak because of their short lives and fragile bodies, yet here she was captured while her comrades had either fled or fallen, their weapons lying useless beside them, the silence of the battlefield pressed against her ears, until even her own heartbeat sounded like thunder in the void. She told herself again and again that she must be strong. She must accept what was coming and not show weakness in front of the enemy. Daniel did not move much. He stood a short distance from her, his gaze shifting across the empty field, as if expecting another attack. But none came. After a long while he looked down at her, his expression calm, not cruel, not mocking, simply calm and steady, like the ground beneath her feet. Lyra could not understand it. She expected anger or hatred, but saw neither, which only made her fear grow deeper, for she thought perhaps humans had ways of hiding their rage until the final moment, when they struck without warning. She remembered the voice of her elder, who had told her once, never trust the smile of a human, because behind it always lies a blade. She thought of that now and braced herself for the sound of his weapon being drawn, the cold strike of steel or fire ending her life. But instead, Daniel knelt on one knee near her, his eyes meeting hers. For the first time she could not hold his gaze. It was too steady, too human, too unknown, and she turned her face away, waiting for the blow that never came. The air smelled of ash and broken metal, yet there was another scent too. Something warm that drifted from him, something alive, and it confused her because it reminded her of the fields on her home world where children once played before the war had begun. She bit her lip hard, trying to fight away the memory. She would not let herself think of home in her final moments. She would not cry before a human. She would keep her dignity until the end. Daniel shifted slightly, and Lyra heard the sound of a pouch being opened. Her heart pounded. She thought perhaps it was a weapon, but when she looked again, she saw his hand holding a small container of water. He placed it gently on the ground near her feet, and without a word moved back to his position, standing tall again and watching the horizon. Lyra stared at the container, her throat burned with thirst, but her pride and fear held her still. Surely this was some trick, a final test before he struck her down. But the longer she waited, the more she realized he had no intention of moving closer or forcing her hand. He simply left it there, as if it was a choice she must make. Silence stretched on, and every second felt heavier than the last. She thought of her people, and of the war, and of how little she truly understood about this human before her. Her breath caught as she realized something strange. She had been ready to die, ready to face human wrath, but she had not been ready for kindness, no matter how small and uncertain that kindness might be. Night grew colder. The fires in the wreckage burned lower, and the stars above shone clearer against the dark sky. Daniel remained motionless, his presence steady like a mountain. Lyra finally leaned forward, awkwardly bound as she was, and touched the container. With her hands trembling, it was real water, clean and fresh. She brought it to her lips and drank every drop. The cool liquid sliding down her throat felt like life itself. She set the container down again, her heart heavy with confusion. Why had he Done that, why had a human soldier spared her suffering? Even for a moment, she could not understand it, and the lack of understanding frightened her more than death itself. She had braced for pain, for anger, for a swift end, but not for this. And as the night deepened, she sat staring at Daniel's back, her mind torn between the stories she had always believed and the reality now standing silently before her. For the first time in her life, she wondered if everything she had been taught about humans was wrong, and that thought alone was enough to keep her awake. Long after exhaustion tried to claim her, the battlefield was quiet. Now only two figures remained, one waiting for death, the other guarding without a word, and the space between them was filled not with wrath, but with something far stranger, something Lyra could not yet name. Dawn came slowly, with a pale light stretching across the ruined battlefield, and the silence of the night was replaced by the distant hum of machines. As human patrols moved through the wreckage, Lyra sat still with her hands stiff from the bindings, her eyes swollen from lack of sleep. She had thought she would not survive the night, yet there she was, alive and untouched. The memory of the water he had given her still sharp in her mind. She could not stop herself from glancing again and again at the soldier who stood a short distance away. As if carved from stone, Daniel had not spoken through the long hours, his figure unwavering and calm, like he had no need for rest. When the sun finally lifted its rim above the hills, he moved with steady purpose, not toward her, but toward the patrol that was coming closer. She heard voices, orders being exchanged, words she could not fully understand. But the tone was clear. The other humans expected something from him. They were looking at her, and then looking at him, as if measuring what should be done. Lyra's body tightened with fear. The moment she had dreaded seemed near, yet Daniel did not hand her over. He spoke in his deep, quiet voice, pointing toward the horizon, explaining something to them. Their faces showed doubt, but they nodded and moved away, leaving her still in his custody. Lyra's chest rose and fell as she tried to understand what had happened. Her fate was still uncertain, yet for now she remained under the guard of one man whose wrath she had once feared, but whose silence now confused her even more. Hours passed and the sun climbed higher. The heat pressed against her skin and her throat ached once more with thirst. She thought she would collapse, but again Daniel came forward. He knelt not too close and placed another small container of water before her without a word. Then he stepped back, as before, his face calm, his posture watchful. She hesitated for a moment before leaning forward to drink, and as the liquid touched her lips, she felt a strange weight in her chest, gratitude, a feeling she had never imagined she would direct toward a human soldier. Her mind kept returning to the stories she had grown up with, tales of how humans burned villages without mercy, and how they captured prisoners, only to use them as tool for cruelty. She had believed all of it without question, and yet here stood one human who had not raised his weapon against her, who had not shouted or mocked or inflicted pain. Instead, he had given her water and spared her humiliation. His silence felt heavier than any words, and she could not decide if it was a mask hiding his true nature or a window showing something far different than what she expected. The day stretched long and shadows grew across the battlefield. Daniel finally spoke to her in a calm and even voice, asking why her people had chosen to strike against humans. Lyra stiffened at the question. She wanted to spit back an answer of pride, to tell him that her kind had been defending their honor in their land. But when she looked at his eyes, steady and without mockery, the words caught in her throat. She lowered her gaze, and for the first time admitted quietly that her people were afraid of what humans might become. Words surprised even her. She had never spoken them aloud before, not even to her closest kin. But here in the quiet before the human soldier, she found them slipping free. She told him that her people had feared the speed of human growth, the way humans advanced in strength and knowledge faster than any species around them. They had seen humans spreading across stars like fire, leaping through dry fields, and fear had driven them to strike first. Daniel listened without interruption, his eyes never leaving her face. His silence did not feel cold. Now it felt like a weight of patience waiting for her to speak more, and she did the stories of her world, tumbled out stories of hunger of elders, whispering warnings that if humans were not stopped, now they would soon dominate. Everything she realized, her voice trembled as she spoke, not from hatred, but from the weight of truth. When she finished, there was a long quiet. Daniel finally said in the steady tone that fear often leads to war, but war rarely ends fear, it only feeds it. Lyra blinked, his words simple, yet cutting deep into her heart. She wanted to deny them, yet she could not. She thought of the faces of her fallen kin, of the children who would never return home, and she realized that nothing had been ended by the battle, only wounds deeper than fate. Before, as the sun set again, the sky painted in orange and red, she felt a strange shift within her. She had braced herself for death, each hour certain that the human wrath would fall upon her, yet what she had faced instead was a patience she had never expected. The soldier Daniel had treated her not as an animal or an enemy to be destroyed, but as a being with voice and reason. It unsettled her, because she did not know what it meant for her future, or for the war that still burned beyond this ruined place. That night, when darkness wrapped the land once more, Daniel remained on guard, his figure tall and still, his weapon close, yet unused. Lyra lay against the broken ground, her thoughts restless. She thought of how her people would never believe this moment. If she lived to tell it, they would laugh at the idea of a human showing restraint, of a human showing compassion, yet she could not deny the truth before her eyes. Every breath she drew that night was because he had allowed it, and that realization left her shaken more than any threat of violence. The stars looked colder than before, but somewhere among them she wondered if hope still lived. Perhaps not hope for victory, but hope for something different, something she could not yet name. The silence between them remained, but now it carried weight and meaning, and she found herself staring at Daniel's back, wondering if she had misjudged not only him, but the entire species he belonged to. She closed her eyes, finally surrendering to sleep, and though fear still lingered in her chest, it was no longer the only thing there. For the first time since her capture, she felt the faintest thread of curiosity about the human whose wrath she had feared, and whose choices were slowly unraveling everything she thought she knew. The morning air was heavy with the smell of burned metal and dust. When Lyra opened her eyes, she expected again the cold end of a human blade or the sharp pain of execution, but instead, she saw the same figure standing with calm strength. Daniel was watching the horizon, his weapon resting against his shoulder, his posture unshaken, like the long night had not touched him at all. She wondered if humans ever tired, or if their will was so strong that even exhaustion bent before them. Her body ached from the bindings, her lips were cracked and dry, her heart unsteady, yet she did not feel the same hopeless dread she had felt on the first night. Something had shifted inside her, a small, uncertain spark. She could not name it, but it grew stronger each time she looked at him and saw no cruelty in his eyes. Daniel approached again. He placed food beside her, simple rations wrapped in thin sheets, and without speaking, he returned to his place. Lyra stared at it for a long moment. The hunger inside her roared, but so did her pride. She did not want to take what a human offered, yet the pain in her stomach won. She leaned forward, clumsy and weak, her hands still tied behind her back. She bent low and used her teeth to tear the package open. The taste was plain, yet it filled her like a blessing she had not expected. As she ate, she kept her gaze low, but her thoughts loud within her mind. She remembered her elders saying that no human would ever feed an enemy, that no human would ever see value in a life that stood against them. Yet here was proof against their words. She wanted to hate him for breaking the order of things. She wanted to hold on to the certainty of rage, but the food in her mouth and the water she had been given before whispered that humans were not what she thought. After some time, Daniel spoke again, his voice deep, steady, but not harsh. He asked her name. Lyra hesitated, wondering if giving it would be a mistake, but there was no threat in his question, so finally she answered, her voice quiet, almost ashamed. He repeated it softly, like he was turning the sound over in his mind. Then he gave his own name. She listened to it, and felt a strange weight in her chest. For now he was not only the enemy, not only the soldier, but a man with a name she could remember. He asked her about her people, what they sought, what they feared. She felt her tongue heavy, but something in his calm made her speak. She told him about her home world, of the barren lands that stretched for miles, of the hunger that drove her people to desperation, of the leaders who whispered that humans would one day spread across the stars and consume everything. She told him of the fear that had become a law among them, fear that left no room for peace. Daniel listened without interrupting when she faltered. He waited when her voice shook. He did not turn away. His silence was no longer heavy with threat, but with patience. She found herself telling him more than she had ever admitted, even to her kin, and each word that left her mouth left her both lighter and more ashamed. She realized how much of their war was built not on truth, but on fear. When she finished, Daniel finally spoke. He told her humans feared too. He told her that his people worried about what other species might do, that they too felt small before the vastness of the galaxy. He said, war was not born only from hunger or greed, but from misunderstanding and fear that grew like fire when no one dared to speak. Lyra stared at him, her mind struggling to hold the weight of his words. She had never imagined a human would admit fear, never imagined they could share such a truth with her. Day passed slowly, and as the sun fell behind broken hills, the sky turned red and gold. She felt her heart beating fast, not with terror but with something unfamiliar. She had braced herself for wrath and destruction, but found instead questions and patience, and words that opened cracks in the wall of hate she had carried all her life. That night, the silence between them changed. She no longer looked at him as a beast waiting to strike. She looked at him as a puzzle she could not solve. She thought of his hand leaving water by her side, his voice calm as he asked her story, his refusal to treat her as less than human, though she was not of his kind. These thoughts spun in her mind until sleep came over her like a tide in her dreams. She saw her people gathered around her, listening to her tell them that a human soldier had spared her life and given her food. She saw their faces twist in disbelief. She saw the fear and anger in their eyes. She knew they would call her weak. They would say she had been deceived, and yet the dream left her unsettled, because she wanted to believe what she had lived was real and not some trick. When she woke again, the dawn was pale and cool. Daniel was still there, standing guard, silent and steady. She studied him with tired eyes and realized that he had done nothing to harm her, though he had every chance and reason. She wondered what he gained from it, what kind of strength it was that could show mercy when killing would have been easier. Her bindings chafed her wrists, but she no longer felt only like a prisoner. She felt like something more, like a witness to a truth she had then denied. She began to sense that the wrath she had feared was not the true strength of humans, but rather the choice to hold that wrath back and turn it into something else, something she had no word for, but which left her chest aching every time she thought of it. As the sun climbed higher, she found herself waiting not for death, but for his voice, for another question, for another chance to see into the strange heart of the man who had undone everything. She believed she did not know what her fate would be, but she knew that she could no longer see him as the monster her people described. He was something far more dangerous because he had made her. Doubt, and doubt, once born, does not fade easily. It grows, it spreads, it changes everything. She looked at Daniel and knew that whether she lived or died, her world had already changed because of him, and that thought left her speechless. The third night passed and the dawn came once more, but this time the quiet was broken by the sound of heavy boots and sharp voices. Lyra looked up quickly, her heart racing as a group of human soldiers approached across the ruins. Their armor carried the dust of battle, and their faces were hard with purpose. Daniel turned to meet them, his hand resting on his weapon. Though he did not raise it, they spoke to him in firm tones, their eyes flicking toward Lyra. As they gave their orders, she could not understand every word, but the meaning was clear. They wanted her life ended. Her chest tightened. She had known this moment would come, but the small, fragile hope she had carried began to tremble, her body stiffened. She braced herself, waiting for the strike, for Daniel to obey as any soldier would, yet he did not move. He stood silent, listening, his jaw tight, his gaze steady. The others grew impatient. One stepped closer, his hand lifting as if to strike Daniel for his delay, but still he did not yield. At last Daniel spoke, his words sharp but calm. He argued against them. Lyra caught fragments of the language, words that meant order, words that meant prisoner, words that meant justice. She could not follow every meaning, but she understood the tone. He was not giving her up, he was standing in their way. The other soldiers grew louder, their voices hard with anger. They pointed at her, they gestured toward the broken machines and the graves of their fallen. They shouted that her people had spilled blood and that mercy was weakness. Lyra's breath shook. She had seen humans fight with fire and steel, but she had never seen them fight with words. And Daniel's words were like iron, his voice cut through theirs, not with rage, but with certainty. He told them something that made them pause. He told them perhaps that killing her would not bring back the fallen, that ending one life would not heal wounds that already bled deep. They scowled, but they listened even as their hands tightened on their weapons. The tension grew heavy, like a storm ready to break. Lyra watched every movement, afraid that at any moment blades would be drawn and she would be the reason for blood to flow again. She wanted to speak, to cry out that she was not worth this fight, that they should take her and end it quickly, but the bindings held her silent and fear locked her throat. One soldier finally snapped. He reached for his weapon and stepped toward her. Daniel moved in an instant, his arm pushing the soldier back, his voice a command that silenced even the most hardened among them. His eyes burned with resolve. Lyra had feared those eyes once, now they were her shield. She realized with a shock that he was ready to stand against his own kind for her. Others hesitated, the air thick with anger, but none drew further blades. One by one they backed away, their voices still sharp with threat, but their feet moving back into the distance, leaving Daniel alone once more with her. The silence that followed was crushing. Lyra felt tears burning her eyes, not from fear this time, but from the weight of what she had witnessed. He had chosen not to obey. He had chosen not to let wrath rule him, and in that choice he had changed everything. When the others were gone, Daniel turned back to her, his face unreadable, but his hand steady. He knelt again and checked the bindings. His touch was firm, but not cruel. He looked into her eyes for a moment, and in that silence she felt more words than she had ever spoken. He was telling her that her life mattered. He was telling her that even in war, there could be choice. The sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the broken land. Lyra's mind spun. She thought of her people who would never believe this story. She thought of the fear that had guided them to strike first, and she thought of the human before her who had stood against his own kind for the sake of mercy. She had believed wrath was the true nature of humans, but now she saw that their strength was far more dangerous because it came from choice and will. Hours passed before Daniel spoke again, his voice low. He told her that he could not protect her forever, that others would come and demand her death, that the war had not ended and mercy was a flame easily crushed. He told her he had a choice to make, and so did she. She looked at him, not understanding, until he moved closer and cut the bindings from her wrists. The ropes fell away, and her hands trembled free. She stared at him in shock, unable to believe what had just happened. She had prepared for wrath and death, but now she felt the air of freedom pressing against her skin. Daniel stood and pointed toward the hills, telling her to go, to lead before others returned. She could not speak, her throat too tight, her heart too heavy. She wanted to ask why he risked so much, why he spared her when killing her would have been simple, but no words came, only silence heavy with emotion. She rose slowly, her body weak yet alive, and she looked at him one last time. His figure tall against the light of the rising sun, his eyes steady, not cruel, not cold, but filled with a strength she could not name. She realized then that this was the true danger of humans, not their weapons or their fury, but their power to forgive and to choose mercy. When hate demanded otherwise, she turned and began to walk, her steps uneven, her hands shaking, every breath filled with disbelief she carried. No weapon, no shield, nothing but the memory of what had happened. She knew her people would doubt her story. They would laugh, they would call her broken. Yet she also knew that the truth she carried was stronger than any blade behind her. Daniel remained still, watching until she disappeared into the horizon, guarding, not a prisoner now, but a choice he had made against wrath and against the voices of his own kind. Lyra walked through the broken fields, her steps slow, her body weak, but her mind alive in a way it had never been before. Every breath she drew felt like a gift stolen from death. She had thought the human would end her with fire or steel, yet he had chosen something else, something her people had never believed possible. She kept moving across the hills, away from the place where the war had left only ash and silence, her thoughts heavy with what she had seen. Sun rose higher, filling the sky with light. She felt its warmth on her skin, but inside she was still cold with disbelief. She wanted to understand why Daniel had spared her, why he had risked the anger of his own soldiers to protect her. She had no answer, only the memory of his steady eyes and the strength in his voice when he refused to obey. She knew her life no longer belonged to her alone, for she carried a truth that could change more than just her fate. As the day passed, she reached the edge of a forest where shadows stretched long and cool. She collapsed near the roots of an old tree, her hands pressed against the soil, her chest rising and falling as she tried to calm the storm inside her. She thought of her people waiting far from here. She thought of what they would say when she returned alive. They would ask how she survived. They would ask what cruelty the humans had done, and she would have to tell them a story they could not accept. She feared they would call her a liar. She feared they would brand her weak for believing in mercy, yet she knew she could not hide the truth that burned inside her, too strong to be buried. She closed her eyes and remembered the sound of Daniel's voice telling her that killing would not end fear. She remembered his hands cutting her bindings and his command for her to go free. She remembered that he had looked at her not as an enemy, but as a being with worth. That night, as the stars came out, she lay awake staring at the endless sky. She thought of how small she felt beneath its vastness, but also how one choice from one man had changed everything. She no longer believed the stories that humans were only wrath and destruction. She had seen with her own eyes that they could be more. She wondered if her people would ever understand, or if fear would blind them forever. The journey back to her homeland took many days. Her body grew stronger with each step, though her mind carried a burden heavier than any chain. When at last she reached the borders of her world, she was met by guards who stared in shock to see her alive. They took her to the Council of Elders, their faces stern and lined with suspicion. They asked her at once what had happened, how she survived when all others had fallen. She stood before them, trembling but firm, and told her story. She told them of the battle and of her capture. She told them of the human soldier who gave her water when she thought death would come. She told them of his patience, his questions, his refusal to kill. She spoke of the moment when other soldiers demanded her life and how Daniel had stood against them. She told them he had freed her and let her walk away, though he could have ended her with ease. The hall filled with whispers. Some laughed in disbelief, others grew angry, their voices sharp, accusing her of being deceived, accusing her of weakness. They said no human would ever show such mercy. They said she had been spared only as a trick to break their will. But Lyra raised her voice stronger than before and told them she had seen the truth in his eyes, that wrath was not the only strength humans carried, that their greatest power was the choice to show mercy when hate demanded otherwise. The council did not accept her words, not fully. They dismissed her as confused by captivity, yet the seed had been planted. Those who heard her could not erase the image of a human who spared instead of striking, and seeds once planted have a way of growing even in the hardest ground. Time passed, and though the war did not end at once, something within Lyra's people began to shift. Whispers spread of her survival, whispers of a story different from the ones told before. Some doubted, some mocked, but others listened with quiet hearts, wondering if there could be more to humans than fire and blood, and as those whispers grew, they carried the weight of possibility Lyra herself could not forget. She carried the memory always each dawn. She thought of Daniel standing guard, his figure strong against the horizon each night. She remembered his voice steady and calm, his words simple yet heavier than any weapon. She knew that whatever path her people chose, she would never again see humans only as monsters, for she had looked into the heart of one and found not wrath but mercy. And far away across the stars, Daniel remained a soldier of his own people. The war still called him forward, but within him too lived the memory of the alien woman he had spared. He knew he had risked much, but he did not regret his choice, for he had shown that even in the darkest of wars, a single act of compassion could defy the weight of hatred. Two would never meet again, yet their lives had been bound by that moment. One expected wrath and found mercy. The other expected to kill and found reason to spare. And from that crossing of fates, a story was born, a story that would not die. Even if the war raged on for years, for stories have a power greater than blades, and this one would live in whispers across both peoples until the day fear itself could no longer rule them. And so it ended. Lyra had braced herself for human wrath, certain that death was her fate, but what Daniel did instead left her without words, and in that silence she carried a truth that no battle could erase, the truth that humans were far more dangerous than anyone had imagined, not because of their fury, but because of their mercy. The end.